Right, so this session, and we got like an hour and a quarter, and we have a 50-minute break between each, where the next guest will arrive. So it's a pretty kind of relentless schedule. So I'll keep my comments to brief. This is a session called Toxic Opinion or Critical Judgement. It's kind of sparked originally, I suppose, by the bullying accusations against the Bartlett, if people were following that about a year or so ago, and the implications that has had on universities. I mean, I teach in Kingston, and we were told, and even though somebody said there wasn't any bullying in Kingston, we were told that we weren't looking hard enough, so we had to find that bullying. So, you know what I mean? It's like round up the usual suspects is a phrase which is now used in universities. As it happens, I do have a quote here, if I can find it, where an article in the Architects Journal said that the tactics being used at the Bartlett by the Bartlett bullies are the same as those used by leaders of groups with fanatical ideologies, and referring to all-nighters, referring to white male tutors, and of course everybody wearing black shirts as architects. So, you know what I mean? Some of this is kind of, there may be a truth to it, some of it may be going to extremes, but this session is really trying to take a look at what the legitimate use of criticism is, whether it's legitimate to criticize, whether we need to be a little bit more open in accepting other views and maybe not being too officious. What is criticism? Is everything open to be criticized, and is everyone a valid critic? So those are kind of some of the things you maybe need to kind of consider. I got two quotes. One of them was on the website, one from 150 years ago, Matthew Arnold, who's talking about criticism is a disinterested endeavour, not uninterested, disinterested endeavour to learn and propagate the best that is known and thought in the world. And then 35 years ago, Ada Louise Huxtable, a very famous architectural critic, said criticism of architecture can and should be practiced as an art. The process of analysis and synthesis is a creative one. So even the process of engaging in criticizing architecture is a creative process. And then 20 years ago, Martin Pawley said criticism is dead. And in some ways, you can agree with that or disagree with that, but there has been a shift in the way people criticize other people's work, whether that's critics on architects in a journalistic sense, or whether it's tutors on students in the university academic sense. So that's the general framework. You get the gist. Hopefully you've read the blurb on the website as well. So we've got three cracking speakers to kind of go through it in the order in which they will speak. We start with Penny in the far right over there in her black shirt. Penny is the head of undergraduates for the joint program in Dundee and Wuhan. She studied in Manchester. She was a journalist and editor of Prospect. Well, still is a journalist. Editor of Prospect. She completed her PhD on ecology and the architectural imagination, and has been she kind of offers a fierce critique, I suppose, on architecture as a cultural identity, and that's also in her latest book, Architecture and Collective Life. There's much more about the biogs, by the way, on the website if you want to check them out. Yes. Eleanor Jolliffe is associate with Allies and Morrison. She's an architectural critic at the RIBA Journal, BD, well, everywhere really. Always constructively critical, especially on the healthy criticism of the RIBA and the ARB. Or maybe that's just my own prejudice, but I really like those articles. She's the author of Architect, The Evolving Story of a Profession, which she also wrote with a fellow speaker, Paul Crosby, coming later on. And that book itself offers a critical review of 3,000 years of practice and education. So it's actually quite a thin book, but very small font. Paul Finch is Programme Director of the World Architecture Festival, has always been a lively voice in the architectural orbit. He's actually been the editor of BD, so Eleanor is a mere scribe. Paul has been the editor of BD, Architects Journal, Architects Review. He's been everywhere. He founded CABE, and he got an OBE, I think, for that actually, Finance for Services to Architecture 20 odd years ago. For this panel, he's known to have a constructive critical opinion about everything, so look out for what your questions, because he takes no prisoners. So that's my introductions. There's much more to know about these guys, obviously, than I've just given a snapshot of, but give them all a round of applause beforehand. And over to you, Penny.
Okay, so apparently you've been given a book, and I've got an essay in that book on the crit. And I don't know how you feel about the crit, but my position is to defend it to the death, if you like. At the moment, most architecture schools are undergoing an incredible amount of pressure from the ARB to change what you teach, pressure from facilities management and estates departments to reduce the amount of space they give for studio, and pressure on low levels of staffing, certainly where I come from, which means there's never enough time to do a proper crit. So there's lots of material reasons why the crit is being undermined, but there's also an ideological one. And I'm really interested in the ideological reasons, trying to understand the ideological reasons behind why the crit is rapidly becoming a thing of the past. And I explain why I think it's crucial to architectural education in that essay. So I've been trying to think about this a little bit a slightly abstract level. I'm doing a book on Hannah Arendt at the moment, so I'm in the world of philosophy. And I've been thinking about this idea of what it means to be critical. And it's a really tricky one at the moment. I kind of knew what I thought it was in the 1990s when people were talking about it and you took sides on one side or the other. Right now, I would say I'm kind of not in favor of being critical. Because being critical is a very destructive way of looking at our tradition and our discipline. It's a kind of questioning that is, has a very destabilizing quality to the discipline of architecture at a time where it might be useful for us to try and identify some of the fundamental things that we think are important and some of the certainties associated with the discipline. So I'm not 100% on that position, and by nature I'm not a conservative person. I'm a person that loves beginning things and loves to think of things from new, but right now I'm kind of finding myself in this, and that's why I'm kind of really looking forward to this discussion. I mean, to be critical means not to take anything for granted, to question things. I like that idea. It means to think, to question, to reflect, and to develop your skills, skills of judgment, the ability to observe carefully, the ability to take those observations and analyze, the ability to then make some deductions from that analysis, the ability to engage in scholarship that allows you to reflect on your thinking and to put it in context. All of those things are the really good things that are associated with being critical and the things that I warm to. But at this very present moment, I think the word critical is being used and is quite often held up, not by Austin, but by others, to just promote the idea of change at any cost. And I went to the Biennale this year just at the last minute. And you look at Leslie Loco's introduction to the Biennale, where she sets out her stall of what she thinks is important in architecture. And the Biennale is a kind of, it was called a laboratory this year, but it is a laboratory for new ideas that are emerging in and around architecture. And she says, we need a laboratory for the future, and we've got to think about ourselves as agents for change. And agents for change also sounds like a great idea. Who doesn't want to be an agent for change? But in the current context, I think it means something that's slightly problematic. And I'm just going to quickly explain what I think that is. And Alan and I had a discussion in Scotland about this a few weeks ago. So being critical as it stands at the moment, the dominant ideological outlook, which we're all supposed to take for granted and sing along with Leslie Loco and others on this sort of script, if you like. The dominant idea is that architecture is now an expanded field. That architecture is not just about making buildings, it's about everything and lots of different things. And of course, architecture is a generalized discipline, so it touches on lots of things. But in the end, as far as I'm concerned, it's about making buildings. The context in which you make them is important, but it's about making buildings. But we're told that architecture is an expanded field, and that's an expanded field that allows the profession to practice in different ways, and it's an expanded field for the discipline. That means building is not the primary objective of the discipline. And you might say, well, yes, that's right, architects are doing lots of different things. But I'm really interested in this definition of the fundamentals of the discipline, because I think they're being so quickly eroded at the moment that everything else that follows from that, particularly our capacity to make judgments and to make better buildings and to engage in intelligent discussions about what buildings are, those are all being undermined by this attempt, not solely by Leslie Loker, but Leslie Loker's the clearest expression of it, to expand the field of what we mean by architecture. Maybe we can have a bit of discussion. So what's interesting about Leslie Loker is she says in here that she's got a new sort of desire for us to be agents of change. She's got a new agenda, but she says this is not didactic. In other words, I am not teaching you anything. She goes on to say it doesn't confirm a direction, offer a solution, or deliver lessons. So this sense that we need change exists, but it doesn't present itself as anything. There's no kind of framework of what this change should be, except for that we need to break down the boundaries that we have normally associated with the discipline, and we need to put aside the things we've done in the past. So in architecture particularly, she says, the dominant voice has historically been a singular, exclusive voice whose reach and power ignores huge swathes of humanity. So there is one idea there, and that idea is that the architect historically has been too much of an individual, a singular individual. The architect hasn't understood collaboration or the collaborative nature of practice, and he needs to, or she needs to, have a different approach to it. And there's this idea that somehow singular, to have a very particular intention as an individual human being, is somehow problematic. And I have a little difficulty with that, because to me, the process of designing a building, of course it's collaborative, but it's also singular. And then the process of judging a building is also singular. And so the process of making buildings and creating a culture of criticism does actually rely on singular individuals. And we're told that that's passé. In fact, we're told that, you know, the only ideology that's really important, that we should all measure architecture by, is that it's not singular, that it's inclusive. And inclusivity is seen as one of the primary objectives, if you like, of architecture in the contemporary context. So just to sort of summarize why I'm talking about this. I'm talking about this because I think at this very particular moment in time, there is an idea of what is critical, and it's not about thinking, and it's not about being highly imaginative, and it's not really about breaking boundaries. It's the formulation of a new set of rules, but they're unspoken. They're not talked about out loud, or they're kind of spoken. The only way you know what the rules are is when you break them, and I'm always breaking them. You've broken them, you say the wrong thing, and then you get your wrist slapped and told that you're not allowed to use that language. Or actually, Renaud de Graaf has written a very good book called Verb, where he goes through and says, you know, this is the professional speak language that you're supposed to use now, and if you don't use it, you'll be penalized. So my basic argument is that I like the idea of criticality, but at the present moment, we're not being encouraged to be thinkers, and we're not being encouraged to look at things from first principle and to use all of our skills as human beings to think critically about things. There's a thing called criticality, and it's really about unpicking all of the assumptions, some of which, not all of which, but some of which are kind of fundamental to the discipline. And actually the idea that an architect is someone who builds is at the core of that and is really critical to that.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed. Eleanor, if you would, please.
So I haven't been in a university regularly for a fair few years, so I've sort of very much approached this from the fact that my drawings, the writing I do on a daily basis almost, they're being put up for criticism. And it never ever gets comfortable, and I don't think I've ever had anything come back without some sort of comment on it. you try not to get emotionally involved and to identify emotionally with the work you're doing. Never yet managed that one either. I'm still working on that, especially when you start working in a team in an office, because my experience day to day is architecture is very much a team sport. It is a group of individuals, but it is a team sport. Now that I'm running small teams on projects, when sort of your team's created something that's amazing and then someone rips it to shreds, it somehow feels even worse than if they're just criticising you. We all want to be told we're marvellous, obviously, and constructive and sometimes unjustified critiques are pretty hard, but it's also how I've learnt a lot. You learn a lot from other people's opinions. If I let myself internalise all of the critiques I got, I would be very defensive and very closed off to all of that potential experience that from other people. But it is hard because we live in an age where anyone can publish an opinion, and online everyone's opinions are published roughly at the same level. One person's Twitter post looks like another. We can get into the world of algorithms, but at the baseline you will start. Anyone can put an opinion out there. And I think we've got to be really careful whose opinion we're giving weight to. For a really obvious example, if I've got a heart condition, I would much rather listen to a surgeon than someone who's read the Wikipedia page about heart attacks. And I think architecturally it follows through. If you're working on a project, the opinion of your client is going to carry a lot of weight because they're paying the bills. The opinion of the planners are enforced by law. The opinion of a friend at a pub over coffee in the office, even if they are an architect, it may not carry as much weight. The same comparison, I think, can be made in architecture schools. So I finished my Part 2 about 8 or 9 years ago, just before the peer-to-peer critiques became really popular as part of the crit process. I think peer-to-peer learning is really important, but you do have to remember that the vast majority of your peers have got the same level of education as you. So sometimes the opinion of the critics or the other tutors is more valuable. Even if they sound really assured. I've come across some really assured sounding people who don't know very much. I think as well, sometimes when people are giving critiques, they're often seeking to justify their own position or underpin their own opinions more than they're commenting on your work. That one was particularly prevalent when I was going through the crit process at the time. And I found that Googling critics before they turned up was quite helpful. 9 times out of 10, you realise just how human they are, no matter how assured they sound in front of you. But historically, I think architectural critique has also been of both great use, but incredibly divisive. The arguments about whether architecture was an art or a profession, or about who was allowed to practice architecture, led to such significant comment and critique within the profession that it spilled over into articles and books published in the Times newspaper, into debates in the House of Commons. I mean, it sounds like a real success for architectural discourse that it became that mainstream, but in fact it set us on what I would argue is the less than successful trajectory of the modern profession, boxing us into a style of practice that's sort of fast losing relevance in the modern construction industry. On the flip side, peer-to-peer learning and critique between students in the 19th century who were sick of what was then an apprenticeship-style education system, where how good an architect you were depended on how good your boss was. That they started up peer-to-peer learning, which eventually became the AA, the first architecture school, and eventually this snowballed into the adoption of defined university-based education like we've got now. Without all that critical discourse and discussion between the students at the time, perhaps that wouldn't have happened. The question for today was toxic opinion or critical judgment, and the one thing I haven't mentioned yet is the high stakes involved with architecture. Regardless of who your client is, if it's Mr. and Mrs. Smith putting a kitchen extension on, or it's a big professional client at a commercial developer, they are leveraging a vast amount of financial and emotional well-being in what you're doing. And that's really important. So I think robust criticism is absolutely key to that. When you're talking sort of someone's financial and emotional well-being. You get it wrong and a company could end up getting in trouble, a family could end up losing their life savings if a building project goes wrong. And so if we're too fragile as practicing architects, I think that's unsafe. It's not really our feelings that are in play here. It's sort of the well-being of other people's lives. Because you've also got to think about the people who are going to use the building going forward as well. The well-being of the building's users as well as those who are commissioning it. But anyway, I'll draw to a close there. I think critique is a good thing, done well.
Well done. Thank you very much. Paul.
Yes, the words are important. Crit is simply a description of what was custom and practice for many decades as a way of, I would say, not criticising projects, but appraising them. Design review or design appraisal, I think, is what happens in a crit. But of course, those four letters are now taken to mean something quite different. The crit, it's inevitably a lot of old white males having a go at, young people, different ethnicities, genders, etc., etc., etc. And of course, if you accepted that for a moment, which I do not, then the crit is over. I don't think it's like that at all. It's an opportunity for critique. And in the case of the Bartlett, the only thing I would say about that, especially since I'm an honorary fellow of University College London, is I found it immensely disappointing that an academic institution's default position in the face of, a handful of complaints from 20 years ago went to a default position that, everyone in this department's a criminal. I mean, I think it's farcical, and I hope I live long enough to see the day when some of the people who've been abused anonymously, that staff, dismissed from their post and had their lives ruined, will have their day in court and sue the hell out of the institution that has just acceded, to my mind, to a form of let's be polite, pressure equals blackmail. So the idea that the crit is finished, of course, isn't true. It might be under pressure in schools of architecture, but let me tell you how it operates in the real world, which is in design review panels. And Allies and Morrison are up in front of design review panels, every other week, because following the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment's promotion of design review, and that's what we called it, local authorities up and down the land have their own design review panels, and anyone who thinks that actually a student crit is rough should get involved in some design review panels on major schemes out and about. Those design review panels may end up as evidence in planning appeals. And if you think anyone's ever been abusive in a crit, take a look at the hostile cross-examination which architects and, of course, objectors get from highly paid barristers at the public inquiry. 14 months ago, I was subjected to, I would describe it as an abusive hostile cross-examination in respect of Make's project for the South Bank, close to the National Theatre, in which I was accused effectively of lying about the reasons for why I was giving evidence in favour of the project, being an incompetent person, not having done any analysis, etc., etc., etc. Well, the scheme has just won approval on appeal. Michael Gove said he didn't like it, he didn't like this, and he didn't like that, but he's nevertheless accepted the planning inspector's report that the scheme has merit, and it should be allowed, so it's going to go ahead. Demolition work has already started. And happily for me, there's a little footnote on page 51 of the inspector's report saying the ad hominem attacks on me. And for those of you who didn't go to private school and don't know Latin, I feel patronising even saying this, ad hominem, it kind of means playing the man and not the bull. And the inspector described attacks to me as ad hominem, and that my down-to-earth approach had caused the objectors to the scheme some discomfort. So I'm counting that as a win for me, and the project's going ahead. The point I'm making really is the circumstances of the student crit and why I think they're a good thing. This is not, by the way, the same thing as getting crits to do your work for your private practice or inviting students to CD parties. It's nothing to do with crits. I'm talking about the crit as an opportunity for students to present their work and ideas and have it appraised in a constructive but critical if it's no good or lazy or missing the point or, you know, willfully misreading the brief, etc., then the criticism should be appropriately tough. And the circumstances in which architects will find themselves in their professional career under all sorts of pressure, for which I believe that crit is an early form of training, are in no particular order dealing with builders and subcontractors who are trying to bug you about. You know, design build contracts. You know, most people go into the world wanting to do a decent day's work. They don't get up in the morning thinking, how can I make life difficult for somebody? But institutionally, the culture of value engineering, at best, creative ideas that will help a project, at worst, stupid cost cutting that dumbs down a project. Example, the housing project at Greenwich, now the subject of legal action, where the house builder got planning permission for one thing and then completely dumbed it down, removed balconies, took out access to roof gardens on the grounds that, oh, building regulations have changed, so we had to do it like this instead. Well, Greenwich Council are going to make them tear that building down if they're successful with their appeal. Or maybe there's a compromise where they have to tear some of it down and you leave the structure and just kind of redress the balance. So dealing with construction and, of course, dealing with clients. You know, clients are not all nice people who want to be cooperative with you and have a cafe latte. You know, some of them are actually quite unpleasant. I spent 7 years of my life as a property journalist in the commercial property world. I still write a column for Property Week. Most of the property people and developers I've met are very pleasant. And there are some who are complete shits, and you're going to have to deal with them. And by the way, your partner or project director or whoever it is won't be impressed if you go back from a meeting saying, I don't think we should work with this man, he's really difficult. And it almost invariably is a man. Not always, but you know, in the world of development, that's pretty male loaded compared with architecture. By the way, just as an aside, about 35 years ago, I saw this story in an old copy of Building Design that fell off a shelf at home. The RIBA did a survey into why was it that the percentage of women in the architectural profession in the UK was so low. Do you know what the percentage was? 13. So don't get the idea, despite all the surveys you read about this and that everything's getting worse in your world and women are put on and it's never been as bad as this. It's all complete nonsense. And you need to look at all this stuff with extreme skepticism and say, well, are things getting better? Flip back. What was it like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? And it's far, far better today than it's ever been before. And practices like this one, the bigger the practice, the more likelihood there is of diversity and all those good things, because they've got the money to employ a lot of people, so you get greater diversity. Small two-man practices founded 30 years ago are never going to be that diverse because they're two-person practices and the people there are the people there. 100% white, 100% male, and they will be till they retire. Do you include those in surveys about diversity? Oh, it's a waste of time. You know, and the other thing, just as a word of warning about so-called surveys, particularly on subjects like bullying. I once asked the then editor of the AJ, published this thing, everyone's being bullied. I said, well, what's the definition of bullying? Oh, they didn't have one. So I said, okay, so basically self-selecting people are responding to your so-called survey, which is not an Ipsos Mori survey. It's not weighted, it's not geographically correct, it's not kind of gender adjusted or any of those things. It's basically the occasion for people who want to answer a questionnaire to say anything they like and make their own definitions of what, oh, I felt bullied, I felt abused, I felt my work wasn't treated seriously. None of this is examined in what I might call a critical way. What does bullying mean? What does abuse mean? Supposing you say to a student, I think this is incredibly lazy because you haven't done any work since the interim crit and this is no better. Can you please show us what you've been doing for the last 2 months? I mean, is that abuse? Is it rude? Should you be more cooperative about it? Be more friendly about it? Or sometimes you think, here's a smart student, what they actually need is a kick up the arse. Because when you're working on major projects and you're going through the planning process, no one's interested in you, having an off day or an off week, or, well, I think I'll do something else, or, I think I'll read Baudrillard this week instead of getting on with those working details. And one of the reasons the architectural profession now is I think is in a difficult position, and one of the reasons why design build contracts started taking over is the systematic lateness of delivery of drawings by architects. No excuses. And as Geoffrey Vickers said, to be systematically late is to be systematically wrong. And I don't think the architectural profession ever has got it into its mind. Even today, they're still in denial about some of the reasons why design build and those forms of contract which remove authority and responsibility from the architect have become ubiquitous in the profession. And the only other thing I would say on that, and I'll close on this one because this is such a huge subject, but one of the things that I didn't go to architecture school, I studied history, so I've got a wonderful advantage of never having designed a building, except my kitchen extension a bit, or in my own mind. But I've been able to see the profession at work for 50 years now. And I think when I think back, the level of construction and technical teaching which now goes on in schools is infinitely less than it used to be. And you see, I think it's not too far of a stretch to see, and what is the outcome of that symbolically? Grenfell Tower, where the sort of ambiguity about who was responsible for what, the technical competence in the detailing and the design, the unscrupulous alterations and changes made through the construction process, the failure of the building inspector. I mean, it's almost like looking at a system which is dumbing down instead of smartening up. And I'll give a quote from a board member of a major institution who are doing a huge building work on their project. And he said, basically, anything that was built around 1858 is going to be okay. You've got the drawings, and basically it was built to the drawings, you can rely on it. Anything built since 1999 is hazardous. And I said, well, that's because no one is going round and telling the builder, you've done that wrong, or you've done that shoddily, tear down that brick wall and do it again. Very few architects have that authority anymore on any significant projects. So you basically let the construction industry, which has got massive, massive problems, low research and development, hopeless profit margins, scraping along on a cash flow basis. These people are marking their own homework and saying, well, our pitch to you, Mr. Client, is that we'll take full responsibility for this. It's all down to us. And if you ask that simple question, well, who actually checks whether you've done what the drawing said or have you built it competently, you will not get a straight answer. And they say, well, if it's wrong, we'll get sued like any other business. Is that sufficient basis on which to build a housing? I don't think so. And I think that actually the only way that architecture can improve its condition is to argue for no responsibility without authority. In other words, if you can be sued for stuff, which you can, for almost anything, architects always get sued, whether it's anything to do with them or not. Design build contracts are no protection. Because the clever lawyers switch all the responsibility back onto the architects, but they don't have the authority sometimes even to go on site. Here's a shocker. On some contracts, the architect cannot make an unannounced site visit. They can only visit the site with the permission and approval of the contractor. Now, where's the quality control? So it's a rough and tough old world out there, and my basic proposition is I think crits should be rough and tough but fair, absolutely not rude and abusive, of course, but that's kind of manners and courtesy. But it doesn't mean they should be cuddly little talking shops where everybody walks out with a nice warm feeling. They haven't learnt anything and they haven't got any of that essential toughening up, because to be an architect, ladies and gentlemen, is a tough business in a tough world. And if you're not up to it and you're going to have a little, kind of thing, because 18 years later you decide, oh, somebody said something in a crit that today if they said that I'd need a safe space, my suggestion is you find another activity to spend the rest of your life in.
Yeah, stick that in your pipe and smoke it. Right, so look, I had lots of questions, but we've had examples of like, what can we say, philosophical, academic approach to this question. We've had the practice-based one, and we've had the life lesson one. So there's a whole range of things to go through. So I'll just come straight out to you if you have any comments or questions or anything like that. Gigi? Okay, thanks. I think the general rule is in a crit, never say, when somebody asks you why you've done something, never say, my tutor told me to do it. All right, so there's lots of questions on the table. If we want to just pick on any one or two or whatever group, and then I'll come back out for more questions. Yeah.
I mean, the risk question is really interesting. It's difficult, isn't it? Because you think there are ideas that are coming from the insurance people and the lawyers, which then become the main ways we think about the discipline of architecture. And risk is one of those words that makes me slightly anxious, because it's about trying to restrain the possibilities in order to ensure that the professional indemnity isn't compromised. And you will talk to architects who say, oh, there are things that I can no longer do because I have to check it with the professional indemnity people, and then they say, no, you can't do that. So there's something outside of the discipline that's entirely determining what kind of buildings we get at the end of the process. And that is another way in which authorship is eroded. So I think the problem, as Paul describes it with Grenfell, was that we're not educating students to be sufficiently technically competent to know things from first principles. So there's a lot of students designing Adobe mud walls at the moment because that's really in fashion, but we're probably not going through the basic mechanics of putting forward primary and secondary structure and making sure that students have internalized that. Partly that's practice's responsibility, but I think sometimes when even technology is very ideologically loaded at the moment. So everything is not judged by does it work, does the water stay out, it's judged by is it sustainable. And that introduction of these ideas from outside, risk, sustainability, they're good in some ways to do that, but they're not good when you take away the fundamental stuff, the building blocks and the logic, because I think then when you go on site, you haven't got the authority to say to the person who did the package for the facade or whatever, ooh, what about the principle of how fire's going to move through that? So risk, I understand what you're saying, but I think we resolve that through doing better technical education so that we've got individuals that are more confident. And the other thing that worries me about risk is that one of the things that the ARB is pushing now in this sort of new thing is take away all the humanities and put in ethics into the program. So lots of schools are starting to work out how they teach ethics. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, that's just baloney, as it's taught, because it's not taught by philosophers, it's taught by architecture teachers and it's a kind of sort of morality without any real morals. And so I think we need to be very careful, I would say, about taking these new words, risk, ethics, and sort of saying, yes, they should now be central to education, because what should be central to education is how to build, not just how to build as a technical question, how to build as a compositional, disciplinary question, how to build beautiful buildings.
I think just to pick up on that risk thing about doing badly in a crit, well, I think the purpose of crits should be explained, in year one. But as a reminder, first off, you have a rough crit, it's not the end of the world. You'll have another one. A poor crit doesn't mean you don't get your degree, far from it. And I think the whole purpose of crits is to strengthen you and to improve your own performance and to point out where you've got to do more. In other words, it's a constructive process, and I've been in crits where it's been praise all the way. And in a way you think, well, this student didn't need much of a crit because they've nailed it, as you say. But for most students, most of the time, it's never as clear cut as that. I mean, I remember doing an intermediate crit at the Bartlett, and we thought that by that stage, we said to the students, this was like a couple of guest critics, and they said, well, is there anything you'd like to see in this crit? And we said, yeah. At the start of each presentation, we want the student to tell us in 30 words what this project is about. And not very many of them could do it. And the reason was, and we kind of got this, was that even at that stage, the thoughts in the students, it was still a bit fluid. There were directions that the project could go in terms of it could be a focus on this or it could be a focus on that. You might have to zoom out a bit or you might have to go in a bit. And that's okay. But actually, when they tried to do the 30 words, you could almost perceive it kind of tightening up their own view of, well, what is my project about actually? And being forced to sort of express it, I think was helpful. Now, so if you make a requirement like that and people feel embarrassed or they don't define it very well, does that mean they failed the crit? On the contrary, I think it's a very positive and constructive outcome. So I would say, you know, the advice to anybody is you've got to take this seriously. And I don't think students should go in thinking they're going in for a little coffee clatch. They should go in feeling nervous. I mean, you're on display, just like you will be in front of some community group that hates your project in 10 years' time. Or a community group, by the way, another word of warning, that doesn't mean everybody. It just means self-appointed people who claim that they're the community. And some groups are great, and some are complete phonies. So, you know, watchword about this, the crits, and in fact everything else is, we used to use this phrase a lot at CABE, especially design review. You've got to try and see things in the round. Don't focus on one thing being the be all and end all. And I would say that for any student who's had such a tough time that, you know, that they really feel emotionally wrecked, then they should get appropriate support. But unless you've got some really nasty people in the room, I've never been in a room where I would say there's ever been anything personally unpleasant. I know there are examples of this, but I think they're such a tiny minority that, and then everybody gets branded in the same way. Of course they should be supported, but the point is it's there to help them, not destroy them. And that is the purpose of crits. And I think old style ones where, you know, you got some tough bastard who would go in to show off as a crit, I think all this went out ages ago. I mean, there are stories from the 1960s that, you know, would make the hair on the back of your neck go up, and I think we've all gone well beyond that.
Happy days.
Very
very
briefly.
quickly.
For me, the crit isn't about training for going to a planning appeal, although I can see the value of that. It's because architecture is a public activity. Like, even if you're doing a private house in the middle of nowhere, it's still, you're contributing to a world which is our common world. And in that sense, I think the crit teaches you about responsibility. That is the ethics. You don't need to have a lecture about ethics. That's the ethics, basically. So it's what you're saying, Paul, but I'm saying it's also more than that. Okay. Architecture, always, you're putting something into the world, and therefore you have a responsibility to the people that occupy the world.
Cool.
In terms of weight of opinion, because that was asked so directly, I don't know if it would actually reduce the number of people who were going to give poor opinions, but if you can reduce the weight to which you're giving to the opinion to somebody who has less knowledge, it might help your being able to get through listening to the criticism. But I don't think, it would be lovely if everyone was lovely, but sadly people are terribly disappointing. And the same with critics or teachers who have walked you through a project and then on the day when it's up on the wall in front of them tell you they hate everything about it. I think everyone's been through that. I would like to tell you that it entirely stops in practice and that your project directors and partners will always hold to their opinions. They won't, because they're people, and there's nothing quite like a deadline or a finished drawing to really focus the mind. The "we're going to build this" moment really makes people decide whether their idea 3 months ago on a Friday afternoon was a good one. It's just part of it, and you just have to go, okay, get on with the next thing.
Make a point about the difference between liking something and admiring it. I mean, it's pertinent. I think good critics, they would never have designed it the way you've done it as a student. They don't like it, but a fair-minded critic will acknowledge the skill with which you've addressed your task. I mean, this comes up in design review. Let's say you've got a scheme by a classical architect, and you've got a bunch of modernists on the design review panel, and you think they're going to get torn to shreds. Not so, because if the critics are fair-minded, they wouldn't design the thing with columns. It's disinterested critique, which acknowledges skill and acknowledges the merits of something, even though you might, inwardly hate everything about it and hope that it would never get built. That's not the point. And I think this is about being fair-minded. And I think the problem with peer-to-peer review, I mean, personally, if I was in the position of having my work assessed, I'm not really interested in people that I've been in the same class with and all the rest of it. I'm quite interested in people who've actually built a railway station or, built a housing development or done a museum or extended a this or a that, who actually know stuff, who've been through the ringer on hundreds of projects. Their opinion about what I've done, I'm actually quite interested in, and I think students should be quite greedy about.
Grand. All right, thanks. So look, anybody that's think we're having some kind of a linguistic, incestuous conversation here, look up the difference between disinterested and uninterested. It's quite worthwhile. You can use it in dinner parties for years to come. Second thing is I do feel slightly put upon here because I teach ethics, but actually I don't teach ethics. I don't teach the ethics that you should be taught. The whole idea about ethics, is that you can have a range of philosophical positions, which is what 5,000 years of philosophy has taught us, that you can be an Ayn Rand person, or you can be a Hobbesian, or you can be whatever, right? You can have different opinions, but the ethics is an approach to a topic and a way of maybe understanding it, and the very nature of critique comes to an ethical position. So where do you stand on a issue? I think is fundamental to you to be able to give the correct narrative, to be able to sell it, and to be admired for having the forthright ability to kind of put that forward. And then the final thing on what Penny was saying earlier about Grenfell, there is a very strange thing happened. Obviously Grenfell was a terrible event. There should have been lessons learned. It's now been 6 years on, and we're really no further forward in terms of a final inquiry report. But the fetishization of fire has become actually part of a problem, I think. Do you know what I mean? We've lost sight of structure, we've lost sight of architecture, and fire is now everything. To the point of, 2 stairs in a block, but nobody knows whether they're next to one another, in which case what's the point of that? Nobody knows if one's a fire stair or a disabled access stair. So the whole thing has just become, what I'm finding, and I teach part 3, is everyone is confused. Ironically, in order to clarify problems, we've actually kind of muddied the water because we don't really know what it is that we're trying to achieve.
Well, you've now got a position where many architects with their professional indemnity insurance aren't allowed to do facade design if it involves certain materials, because it's now assumed that the architect is incapable. This is after a century of doing it perfectly well. Are assumed to be incapable of designing a facade using materials which will burn. Well, all materials will burn. And so this is a very shocking example of how a reactive insurance sector then starts to influence what's taught in architecture, what's abandoned. And architects, in a way, in a Pavlovian sense, will say, well, if I haven't got insurance cover to do this, therefore I can't desert, so I've got to get in a facade consultant. And then I've got to get a building regs expert in, got to pay them out of my fee to make sure it's a conforming design, etc., etc., etc. And then a generation on from that, and there are a whole load of people who come through school and their early career, and actually they couldn't design a facade anymore because they haven't had to.
By the way, a very good non-flammable material is asbestos. Anyway, moving on. Alan, do you want to come in and comment? And then can I see the hands at the back that I missed out earlier? Okay, good. Very good. Right. Whacking great range of questions. Really interesting. I'll come back down the pound. Penny, do you want to pick up? Short and sharp. We've got probably 2 minutes each or something.
Okay. So I agree with the guy at the back that says marketization is an issue. It definitely is an issue, and anybody teaching in a university would be lying if they didn't see what you're saying in terms of the pressure on people not to fail students is quite significant I think across the board. And so there's a constant struggle to maintain what you think is standards as a teacher. But I don't think, if you look at awards, if you look at the quality of journalism, if you look at all of these things, which I kind of have a very pessimistic view of seeing these things going downhill, particularly awards, there's always been the market has always operated in influencing those things, but somehow we managed to create some insulation that meant that we were still judging architecture on its own terms. And I think it's that insulation. So the market operates in university, but teachers who've been through the system still really value making proper assessments of students' work, regardless of the pressure that they're under. But what I'm worried about is that insulation, that kind of is the boundary of the discipline, if you like, is being undermined. And I suppose somebody said sometimes there is unfair behaviour, but we don't want a cancel culture. And I agreed with what you said as well. I mean, I think one of the things that maybe as students people don't understand is, particularly in relation to studio, is that individuals put an incredibly large amount of themselves into the design of the studio. I mean, sometimes to a ridiculous amount. And at the moment, they're being told not to do that, that's not the way forward. And one of the things that upsets me most about the UCL thing is that it's almost saying you should not engage your whole personality and your whole commitment to the development of the discipline, because if you don't put a little barrier between yourself and your passions and your teaching, then, oh God, imagine all the problems that is. So there's a kind of risk-averse form of teaching that's being codified through things like the UCL thing. So I think if you have a slightly badly behaved tutor, you should just call them out, as Alan said. And in fact, one of the reasons why we can't do that is because we're going along the lines of this much more ideological thing of you as a human being shouldn't really engage with the students as a whole person. But also because we have not got the practice of judgment. We've got rid of the practice of judgment for both students and for teachers. We just don't habitually judge architecture. I mean, most of what I do is history, so I'm like marking history essays, encouraging people to do good history essays. Students no longer know, and they haven't picked it up through studio, or the third year students do not know how to make judgments about a building anymore. And part of the reason for that is because people like Barnabas Calder writes a new book of the history of architecture, which he's kind of thematically reorganized on the basis of an environmental perspective. So when we look at the Pantheon, he does say a little bit, this is a great piece of engineering. He's buried the Pantheon right in the middle of the history among lots of Islamic temples and things, and it's there, and he does say this is a really great achievement. But mostly what he talks about is how much energy it took to make the Pantheon. Now you could say, well, that is interesting, and actually but we talk about the Pantheon because it helps us think about composition, about the relation between section and plan, about circulation, about the place in the city, about what we think about form and there are lots of things just central to the discipline that students aren't doing anymore. So when they come to write a building review, they say, oh, it's really successful and it's really sustainable and it makes really great experience to be in this building. And that's it. They've got none of the tools to think about these things. And that will be having a major impact on the buildings that they design, because if the only criteria by which you judge is it sustainable, then we've kind of lost 2,000 years of tradition of architecture that we built up overnight. So that's why I'm saying it's sort of critical, but not so critical that we lose what's important in the first place.
Very good. Thank you very much, Alan.
I wanted to pick up on this idea of the disinterested, and sort of, I think what's key to remember is when you're practicing architecture for better or for worse is a profession. To be a professional, to give a professional opinion, means you have to act in the interest of your client, not necessarily in line with your personal opinion. I'm not saying go out and do something completely unethical, but your opinion that a wall might look better, say pink than blue, doesn't matter, really, if it's in the interest of your client that it's blue. I mean, that's a very cosmetic example, but I think that's the key. To be disinterested is to give yourself a slight emotional remove. I'm not saying don't put passion into it, but but you need to recognise the point at which your passion tips over into just personal preference. That's the point at which you stop, and that's the point at which you have to be disinterested and professional. There's a lot of things I've designed that if I was paying for it and if I was doing that, I'd do it slightly differently, but it's not in the interest of my client to do it like that, or the users of the building. And the other thing in terms of knowledge, if you read, go and read my book, but over the last 2,000, 3,000 years, especially since in the last 50, architectural education is increasingly divorced from construction and the technical stuff. So when someone was asking about a student having authority on a building site, quite simply you can't, because you don't understand the materials. It also means that what you're designing in the nicest way possible is probably a bit rubbish because you don't understand how a building goes together enough. And I'm still learning. You will pick up a lot on site, so be careful who your first job is with, because you're going to learn a lot from them. If they let you design everything by yourself on the first day, you probably don't want to be working for them. But it is a slow burn career. You have to be prepared to do 6 months at a time of moving light fittings around on a ceiling plan. It's really tedious, but you learn so much from it. The same with door schedules and details. It's tedious, but then suddenly you find you know how to do it when you have to come up with it quickly on the spot or on site, or when the contractor is pushing you. You can fall back on your instincts and the knowledge that you've gained, but it is about seeking out the knowledge, because as you're demonstrating, it's getting increasingly difficult to find really good sources of that don't have a different, they're not recasting knowledge through a different lens.
Very good, thank you very much. Paul, you've got a very short time.
Yeah, a few reasons to be cheerful, which address some of these issues. Firstly, I think AI will be an immense benefit to the architectural profession. People keep it's going to wipe us out. I don't think so. It may be the reason why architects can indeed get back into facade design and all sorts of other technical things, because you'll have the power of ChatGPT or whatever platform you're using to help you, and those platforms will be common, so you'll be on an equal playing field. And because architects, generally speaking, they're smarter than contractors and they're smarter than most other built environment professionals, so I think that's a good thing. I think global learning means you can make constant comparisons the whole time. At World Architecture Festival, you know, we get 850 entries from around the world for our awards. You can see how architects from many different countries address the same problems: technical, environmental, climatic, social, about equity and so on and so forth. It's a wonderful time to be learning from examples from everywhere. Don't forget there are multiple ways to succeed in architecture. There's still a feeling that you'll get taught to be Le Corbusier, and hardly anybody ever can, but there are multiple things that you can excel in your own practice, and it's up to you to find what you really like and what you're really good at. I think despite, you know, the whole cancel culture thing and various other things that happen, happily, so far, cultural appropriation has not hit architecture. You know, you can't say, oh, you're a black architect, you can't design for white people. You're white people, you can't design for black people. If you're a woman, you can't design a man's lavatory. If you're a man, you can't design a woman's nursing, etc., etc. It hasn't arrived on the architectural scene yet, I don't think. And if it does, for God's sake, resist it at all costs, because and the classic example at the V&A at the moment, the exhibition of Jane Fry and Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew, who invented this thing called tropical modernism. So there's middle-class white English people worked out a sort of architecture that would work in West Africa, and got warmly embraced by Nkrumah and Ghana and various other people in the 50s and 60s, because it was their mind that was working, you know, not the colour of their skin. Their work was as architects. And finally, on the great climate change energy front, I'm so looking forward to the moment, and I don't think it'll be that far away, when most of the energy we produce will be virtuous. Nuclear, solar, wind, wave, fabulous batteries, and this tedious argument, which is what it is to me. Oh, the Pantheon's a bad building, look at all that energy they use. I mean, get a life. If the energy is virtuous, you can run that air conditioning 24 hours a day without feeling guilty. So all those people who want to go and live in Dubai and the desert and NAOM and all the rest of it, there's a laboratory for the future, by the way, the NAOM project. Of course, if it's a laboratory, the experiment might fail. And you also have to know what the experiment is. You know, a laboratory without a program is like a cinema where no film is showing. But on the whole, I think there are enough reasons to be cheerful to more than make up for the potential harms that we've been suffering as a result of woke twerp cancel culture.
Very good. Right, very quickly to say that the calling out of bad tutors, I have a slight worry about. I mean, I get it, and obviously there's an element, you know, if you're being molested, then fair enough, have a word, right? But generally, it then comes down to what do we mean by bad tutors, and that's part of the problem, is that that's what the Bartlett thought they were doing, calling out everybody who they thought was bad. So we have to, the judgment exercise about knowing what we're talking about is fundamental to this conversation. And the second thing is this environmental pantheon thing. I don't want to bang on about it too much, but there is this now kind of creeping scenario, not just within academia, but more worldly in terms of criticism generally, is this kind of spreadsheet rubric culture, which then puts these things on a sheet where you literally have to go through the crit and say, have you dealt with the energy? Have you done the sustainability? Have you done? So then, you know, then the design comes a very poor 10th or something. Do you know what I mean, right? So you can pass with a crap design, but it's a very good energy saving model. That somehow is inverted logic as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, what does it matter what I think? Give the panel a very warm round of applause.